welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone. Hello, Heartful Parent Podcast listeners. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of the podcast. If you've been with me for some time, I appreciate you. And if this is your first time joining me on the podcast, thank you as well. I appreciate you, and I hope that you will get a lot of value and keep coming back. I work hard every week to provide great content, great value, great education, thought-provoking conversations, etc., etc. So wherever you are in the world and whatever time of day it is, I hope that this finds you well and engaged and ready to learn. If you've been with me for any period of time, you know that I often have guests on the podcast, and I love talking with other people and finding out about their experiences and their expertise, especially that is outside of mine, which there are many people that fit that category, right? And I also sometimes come to you just on my own solo shows. And today's going to be another solo show. And there are a number of reasons for that. Some of it is just, scheduling and the way that the cookie crumbles. But a bigger piece of that is sort of in contemplation of what's going on around the world right now. So we're going to dive in today to what I call the S.C.A.R.E.D framework. And this is a framework that I created. And I did it back. So just to give you a little bit of context for this. So as I'm sure everyone remembers, during the pandemic, there was the horrific murder of George Floyd, and that led to a lot of awareness about other unjustified killings, about sort of the racial inequities that our BIPOC members of our community experience. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term BIPOC, if you're joining us from outside the US, or it's just not one you've heard before, it's Black, Indigenous people of color. So there was this kind of reckoning, and then there were protests and marches and all sorts of things going on around this really major realization for a lot of people that, hey, there's some things happening that aren't okay. And of course, the Black members of our community have known that for, decades and longer. But it was this kind of, suddenly it was all put on display. And a lot of parents were saying, I don't know how to talk to my kids about this. And I want to talk to them in a way that, feels accurate and feels educational, but also doesn't scare them unnecessarily. And I've heard that same refrain time and time again over the years, right? I want to know how to talk to my kids about this. This is really scary. They need to know about it. I want them to be aware, concerned, involved citizens. They're going to hear about it anyway. And I want to talk to them about it in a way that doesn't have them feeling, unnecessarily scared and anxious and all of those things, which is a tall order sometimes, depending on the issue. And there are inequities in that, right? We know that there are conversations that Black parents need to have with their children that white parents have been able to get by without having. I recognize that. And I still think there are issues that parents of all backgrounds, all colors, need to talk to their kids about, but don't know how. And they don't want to scare them unnecessarily, like I said. This came up most recently this fall when I was reached out to by a group of parents who were living in a community near Seattle or part of Seattle where there was a series of robberies happening where tweens and teens were having their cell phones stolen, sometimes at gunpoint, but certainly under threat. And they were saying, we don't know how to talk to our kids about this and how to keep them safe. And I think this is coming up even more recently with all the events happening in Israel. For any of you that have followed the news at all, you know that Israel has declared war. There were absolutely brutal attacks by Hamas, really of the caliber of 9/11, where Jewish Israeli citizens are just being murdered because of who they are, right? It's really, really awful. And although kids will understand that and process that differently, particularly if they're not living in that part of the world, it's still really scary to hear. And they may have questions about what could happen here. And we know that this is having worldwide implications because Jewish citizens the world over, synagogues the world over have been receiving threats. Jewish Americans are under threat. And that is something that we've seen increasing in recent years anyway. And so, again, parents are saying, how do I talk to my children about this? And unlike when many of us were growing up, children are being exposed to a lot more because of the internet. It's not just the nightly news, the 6 p.m. nightly news with Dan Rather or whatever, whoever we were listening to back in the 80s. There is social media and the constant updates on people's phones from, whatever news sources you follow. And kids are seeing that and they're hearing that and they're talking about it in school. And especially if your kiddo is Jewish or has Jewish friends or Jewish classmates, they're hearing about it. And teachers may be addressing it as well. And so parents are once again saying, what do I do? How do I talk about this? So this T.A.L.K framework, as I said, it arose out of the murder of George Floyd. But it really is a universal framework to use to talk to your kids when you don't know how to talk to your kids about difficult things. And so here we go. T.A.L.K. Each letter in T.A.L.K stands for something. So it's an acronym. So we're going to start with the T. And the T is talk. Start the conversation. So the important thing to know is that kids won't always bring up these subjects. They won't always ask you questions. They may be trying to process really big adult things on their own and not even know how to ask. So we need to make sure that we're not leaving it up to our children to bring up the subject. When we stay silent and try to shield children, it may make it more difficult for them because if they do hear it from others, or if they sense something is wrong, they're going to wonder why we're being silent. You may have heard me say the same thing around sex. When we stay silent and wait for children to ask us questions about sex and bodies, we're basically putting the responsibility on them to, that we're putting the responsibility for their sexual health and sexual understanding on them. And that is unfair to put that on a child. And I think this is too. When there are big things or small things happening in the world, it's our job as parents to educate them, right? And to give them a sense of safety. So Dr. Dan Siegel talks about the 4 S's, which is to feel safe, seen, soothed, and secure. And by starting the conversation and diving into the rest of the T.A.L.K framework, that is how we can help our children feel safe, seen, soothed, and secure, especially that safety piece and that security piece, right? So start the conversation. And then make sure that it's not just you lecturing them. So the A in the framework stands for ask and encourage questions. We need to make sure that we are giving them time to ask questions, letting their brains, little or big, process what we're telling them or talking to them about, and let them ask whatever they need to ask, right? We also need to ask questions of them. What have you heard? What do you know? What worries you? Things like that, right? So instead of it being a one-sided sort of monologue, we need to at least invite the possibility of a dialogue. And if you have very young children, there may be less of that, but the older they get, the more engaged hopefully they can be, and they'll have more questions. So ask and encourage questions. All right, the L of the framework of T.A.L.K is to limit media exposure. And this really means for both us and for our children. And yes, I'm a believer that we need to be aware of what's going on in the world. Like, that's part of being a responsible citizen, is to have at least some idea of current events and what's happening and what are people saying and what are people doing and, what are the leaders of our country and our world saying and doing. That's important for us to know and understand. And when we watch things on repeat over and over again, when it's like trauma on repeat, that can be very difficult for our nervous systems. It can also be very difficult for our children's nervous systems. The news is not child-friendly, and repeated exposure to traumatic images or traumatic events is not healthy for anyone. So we need to get the information that we need, and to the degree that we can, limit media exposure, especially in our younger children. Don't watch the news with them in the room. Don't listen to the radio, like NPR, wherever you get your news. Don't listen to the radio with them in the car. Put on a good, kids podcast or a good, kid-friendly audiobook. Do that when the kids are in the car, and save the gathering of information and the gathering of news when you are in adult company. Now, as your kids get older and they are teens, and especially older teens, of course, they can see some of it. But again, it's good to teach everyone and remind them that listening to these things on repeat or watching them on repeat is really traumatic, right? We all did that after 9/11. I remember watching, the images of the two planes crashing into the towers over and over. And if that is trauma, right? It's trauma. So let's learn from that and not repeat it. Okay. The K in T.A.L.K is to know and share the facts. And this is really important. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there on the internet. So our job as the adults is, to the extent we can, to gather that information, that factual, accurate information, and to share only what we know, right? Share the factual information. Correct inaccuracies in our children's understandings, and acknowledge what we don't know. There may be a lot of things that we don't know. You may, like me, I don't know all the ins and outs and sort of the nuances and the history of the tension and the relationships between Israel and Palestine and all of those things, right, that are coming up right now in the news. Am I embarrassed to admit that I don't know all of those in great detail? Yes. But it's important that I don't guess when I'm talking with this about my children. So I need to look up information. I need to gather information from reliable sources and share what we know, what's accurate, and make sure that our children have accurate information as well. So regardless of what the situation is that we're trying to explain to them, correcting inaccuracies is important. And then it's okay to say, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know why. I don't know, exactly when or how or what. That's okay. If you're able to gather it, then say, I don't know, but I will see if I can find out. And if it's information that's just unknowable, either now or ever, you can acknowledge that. Okay, so that's the talk in T.A.L.K. So remember, it's talk, ask and encourage questions, limit media exposure, and know and share the facts. All right, let's move on to the S.C.A.R.E.D portion of the acronym. So S, see the good. So remember how I said that we need to help our children feel safe, seen, soothed, and secure? It's really helpful for both our nervous systems and theirs to remind them of the good. There is always good. There are always people helping. There are always people trying to do something. And we need to remind our children of that. And we need to look for examples of that. So Fred Rogers, the famous Mr. Rogers, said that when he was a boy, he would see scary things in the news, and his mother would say to him, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And I think that's a great reminder as we are navigating scary world events. Whether we're talking about the situation in Israel, racial profiling or murder, or global warming, whatever it is, if we can help our children see the good, that adds to that sense of safety and security that they need, right? All right, the C in the T.A.L.K. framework is to care for yourself. We cannot parent well if we are not taking care of ourselves. So focus on self-care, especially if you are feeling triggered, anxious, upset. If you yourself are Jewish, a Jewish parent, I can't even imagine what that's like right now. Please take the time to take care of yourself. You must do that before you can take care of them. So model that self-care, model regulating your emotions and coping with anxiety, and then teach your children how to do the same thing. Okay? The A in S.C.A.R.E.D is to acknowledge the why. So children are going to have lots of questions about why people do bad things. We can help them understand that sometimes people make egregious choices in response to their own trauma, their own history, their own big emotions, their own situation. And not that that excuses the behavior, but it helps us understand it. And so we can tell our children there are no bad emotions, but that does not justify bad behavior. And so we can try to explain the why, even for things that feel inexplicable. Now, when we do that, we need to be very careful of unconscious bias and racism in doing that, right? That can slip into these conversations so easily. So check yourself, moms and dads, check yourself. Make sure that you're being really conscious and careful about the language that you're using. But acknowledge the why to the extent that you can. And again, it's also okay to acknowledge what you don't know. The R stands for reassure. Validate and normalize your child's feelings, okay? If they are feeling scared, if they are feeling anxious, let them know that that's okay. Don't tell them to get over it. Don't mock them or shame them or say, oh, come on, it's not a big deal, or it's not happening to you, or it's not here, or yes, it's scary for them, but it's not scary for you. Because it might feel very scary to your child. So validate and normalize their feelings. Focus on connecting with them, listening to them, and help them name those emotions, right? Dr. Siegel also says we have to name it to tame it. So name those emotions that they're feeling. Name the emotions that you're feeling. And then tame it. Give them some tools to calm that down. But as we're doing that, we want to reassure them. We want to reassure them that we are doing what we can to keep them safe. We need to talk about where things are happening in the world. Again, referring to those people that are doing the good, that are there to be the helpers, right? We want to reassure them to the extent that we can. All right, the E in the S.C.A.R.E.D is empathize and emotion coach. Now, we can and probably will do a whole nother episode on emotion coaching, or multiple episodes, but we want to make sure that we are empathizing, that we are stepping into our children's shoes and understanding how scary these events might feel from the eyes of a child or a teen whose brains are not fully developed. I mean, frankly, these things are terrifying for adults. I don't have words. I can't process this effectively, right? And so we need to make sure that we are empathizing with those feelings, whatever they are, and then emotion coaching them, which really means that we are stepping in to an awareness of where they're at. We're connecting with them. We're listening to them. We're identifying the emotions and working with them to find solutions. Now, in this case, the solutions might be ways to regulate our emotions, right? It's not like we can solve what's happening in Israel, but the solution might be ways to regulate ourselves and manage our nervous systems, okay? And then finally, the D in the T.A.L.K S.C.A.R.E.D framework is don't parent alone, right? We don't want to try to navigate all of these things by ourselves. So reach out for support. Get support from a neighbor. Get support from a family member. Get support from your partner if you are parenting with a partner. Get support from a parent coach, right? That's what I do. I spend my days working with parents one-on-one, as do some coaches who work with me. Get support from a therapist. Get support from your child's school, letting them know what's going on for your kiddo. There are lots of places and ways to get support, and we should never parent alone, especially when we are parenting through events and trauma like what's happening around the world and in our own communities, right? We need to be the village for one another. All right, so that's the framework. I'm just going to remind you again. So it's talk scared. Talk, start the conversation. A is ask and encourage questions. L, limit media exposure. K, know and share the facts. S, see the good. C, care for yourself. A, acknowledge the why. R, reassure. E, empathize and emotion coach. D, don't parent alone. I hope this is helpful to you. You will be able to download a free handout or copy of the Talk Scared framework on my website. If you go to theheartfulparent.com/podcast, click on this episode and you will find that download. If you are out there dealing with, big emotions and feelings around the events that are happening right now, please know that I see you, I feel you, I'm here for you. If there's anything I can do to support you on your parenting journey, that's what I'm here for. Take care, be safe, and don't be afraid to talk scared. See you next week, everyone. Take care.